All right, we're recording. It is January 6th, 2021, and we've got plenty to talk about today. Some PRs came in over the holidays, and I also have made some progress towards conformance. Maybe it's progress, I don't know. But I wanted to take a few steps back and take a closer look into the precedent that has been set and what I'm at least initially proposing and kind of my rationale for getting there. Um, so for anyone that may have seen the PR come in earlier this week, I have kind of a work in progress here that is a really, really simple idea of what conformance tests could at least start with for service APIs. These are painfully simple in the sense that they are literally just vanilla Go tests that rely heavily on some helpers. Just t.run, this is what we expect should happen, wait. It should look very similar to tests you've seen throughout Kubernetes repo itself. One somewhat weird thing is it kind of structures things into scenarios. This matches at least conceptually what ingress controller conformance is doing of apply or create a bunch of resources, and ingress controller conformance, it's just create ingress, but in this case it's create all our resources and then describe what should happen, right? Describe what we want to observe. So here's our opening state, and here's what we want to observe here, given whatever controller, and you provide a controller. So this is the really high level idea of what I wanted to accomplish here in the simplest way possible. And if you look at this, you'll notice that this is not exactly ingress controller conformance, which is where I started. And so I wanted to take some time to explain my reasoning and get some feedback on this. I know there's a lot to take in, so I'm not really wanting to, come to a final conclusion today. But I already wrote what feels like a bit of an essay in this PR, and I didn't want to go much further here. But I did want to kind of take a few steps back, look at what ingress controller conformance is right now, and maybe how we can get the two kind of approaches to converge. Because I did spend a lot of time working on ingress controller conformance and trying to get that to where I thought it could work well with service APIs, but I think there's still enough of a difference that it made sense to start with something simpler here first, as long as it was following a similar pattern and could easily, be merged back together in the future. So with that, let me take a step back and look at ingress controller conformance. This is also a relatively recent project. Well, the current state of it is relatively recent. It started with some rather simple structure and then moved towards a structure that uses Godog and defines features and tests like this. So here's the ingress I want to apply. Here's what I expect it should do. That's the whole idea behind this, right? So really straightforward, but it also, well, before I add any buts, it also gives you some really cool HTML output, and I would love to recreate this. So I definitely want to try to take the absolute best parts of this, and I think this is a great one. It also provides a GitHub action that you can use. So install your cluster, your controller in a cluster, and this GitHub action will, or actually I think you just provide a manifest that can be used to install your controller, and then this GitHub action will do the rest to actually run conformance tests, which I think is quite clever. So there's a lot of good work that's happening here. With that said, I think there's also, oh, well, okay, one more thing. And I think Minishift has a great example of doing tests with GoDog very well. So Minishift is a really cool tool, and I think it's seemingly simple enough, or the tests are simple enough that it's easy to understand these test cases, to me at least. What I'm concerned about with service APIs, and what I want to make sure we're comfortable with, is service APIs has a lot of complexity, and that complexity may be hard to communicate with these API, with tests quite like this. And even with Ingress, what I found challenging is when the tests fail, it's hard to understand what exactly happened. And there's ways, and I'm working on ways to improve this. But part of the, the both benefit and pain of an abstraction like this is when the test fails, you get pointed to a feature file, and then you need to figure out, well, okay, so I know that feature line. Now, how do I figure out the code that's actually pointing to that? And then you find, okay, well, this is the function, but where inside that function, and etc. There's not the same kind of clear relationship between a test failure and the specific line it failed on. It'll give you the function, but that's about as much as I've been able to get out of it. So as an example, here's the features file. Really, when I send X to Y, here's what I expect back. And here's the Go file that goes along with it. So you can see, okay, anything that matches this goes to this function all the way down. So you can say, okay, a new random namespace, I need to go down to this function. That's this, so something in here failed. And then something in here failed. Which one failed? I'm not sure. So this is all savable, but at least to start, my hypothesis is that we can start with something a little bit simple, a little bit simpler, that still follows the same pattern and leaves room to kind of merge the two approaches together in the future. I don't know. So I've spent way too long. I don't want to spend much more time talking. Well, just just giving this intro to conformance tests and where my mind was. But that's how I landed here. I'll be the first to admit this is very basic, very simple. That was by design. It may be too simple, but I just wanted to get some broader feedback here and some thoughts on conformance tests and how we should structure this. If we should, anyway, is this a reasonable first step, or should we try to mirror ingress controller conformance a little bit more closely? I don't know. I'm very open to feedback on this one. This has been hard to really get to a good place.
I mean, I feel the pain that you went through and where you have landed. I'll take a look at this and get back to you either today or tomorrow. I'm liking what I'm seeing right now in a very brief look, but to have a more informed feedback, I need to go back and look. But this seems to be in the right direction to me.
Thanks. I appreciate that feedback. And I want to be clear. I'm not saying we should just drop everything about ingress controller conformance. My intent here is to build something that's reasonably close enough that we can still use all the same tooling, all the same helpers, ideally have the same kind of output. really take advantage of everything that's done so well there. But maybe, my hypothesis is that service APIs are a more complex thing than Ingress, and it will be more complex to test. And the pattern that was used for Ingress may not work as well when it comes to actually writing the specific test. And so I just, I'm not saying a wholehearted, complete shift away from Ingress controller conform. It's just this very top level of how we're actually writing the tests, not the helpers, not everything below that, just this top level maybe can be done just in a more traditional way. I don't know. But yeah, okay. Very, very open to feedback on this again. This is very early on. I'm just going to let this sit for a little bit. I've gotten some feedback from John, and he has some really good thoughts on how we could potentially test this and integrate this with other projects. So let's say, so Istio is wanting to run conformance tests against our API, and they already have their own test framework that already has, a cluster spun up with their controller in it. Can we somehow integrate that and make that part of their Go test suite? I'm not sure. I'm interested in what other projects might be doing here, and if there's kind of a common pattern that we could integrate with. I can see this being very compelling. I just don't know how to actually make it work. So if you already have a conformance suite or a test suite that this could integrate with, I'm very interested in ways that we could structure this to fit in nicely.
Yeah, I know Contour has a bunch of stuff written using Rego. If you're into Rego, that works. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. I'm still trying to wrap my head around Rego. To me, it's hard to follow and read, but it's kind of powerful in how you can kind of conceptualize some of that. But I kind of like what you have here better than what we've done in Contour. But yeah.
Cool. Yeah, no, I have a limited experience, enough experience to have written one policy and test for that one policy. And it has a learning curve, that's for sure. But yeah, it feels like endless power once you get used to it, but it takes a while to get used to it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, I'll leave it at that for now. Somehow I'm not signed in here. Cool. Anyways, and yeah, just a reminder, this PR exists, and I just, I felt like I didn't do well enough communicating that I wasn't trying to drop Ingress controller conformance entirely. I just wanted to not use 100% of it with this approach. So yeah. With that, I will move on to PR triage. There's been a few PRs that have come in. Okay, so this, I think we'll have enough time to go through all of these, so I'll just start at the top. This one is a fun one. James discovered this as the first person to write a PR in the new year. Congratulations. And what he found is 100% of our code gen ended up switching to copyright 2021 because that's how our templating works. So even if the files weren't changing, we run code gen, and what do you know? This is what we get. So that's not ideal. Not ideal at all. Not the end of the world, but ideally this doesn't change every year, and changing to a newer date for an older file feels not correct. So I did some digging, and it looks like the vast majority of projects like ours have actually removed date entirely from their boilerplate. And so they just use copyright without a year. So that was my idea with this PR. I went through a few different things. One thing that feels especially strange with this PR is that we have a verify boilerplate too that expects it to match our boilerplate text. And so that means even in non-generated files, we have to remove the copyright year to make this change, which feels strange. I am very used to, having a year here. I am absolutely not a lawyer. I don't know the meaning of this. Harry, you've weighed in here a bit. Do you have any suggestions for what we could do here or any concerns?
So, can you help me understand how you came to the conclusion that you need to remove the year from the files that we have written rather than auto-generated?
That's a great question. So I came to that conclusion because tests were failing. That's all. So what we could do is we could split up our verify boilerplate code. So if we go to this is a very standard file, right? And it just goes through all of our boilerplate files and expects them to have the appropriate effects go files to match go dot, boilerplate.go, etc. So we could have different boilerplate files. I'm not really sure. I should dig into more examples, but what I've seen so far is the pattern of just not having a year.
Sorry, go ahead.
But I think those projects all started that way, and it feels weird to go from having a year explicitly to not. So we kind of started with a weird, with the year, and I don't know.
I see. So the thing is the tests are still failing on that PR. So
yeah.
So we have to go back and read that boilerplate.py. I haven't read it thoroughly, but I think if we remove a check of the year from the Python file, we don't need to remove the year from the files we have written, and that error will go away. So, but need to again, haven't had enough time, but we need to go back and look there.
Okay. Yeah,
and
that would be great.
I tried to find some CNCF guidelines around this, but I could not find much.
No.
So if somebody else has, and I think in upstream Kubernetes, what they have is, or what the project has is the auto-generated files don't have the year, but other files do have the year.
Yeah, that sounds appropriate. Let me dig into it a bit further. I did spend some time looking at the CodeGen for upstream as well, and couldn't figure out how they were making it work. But you're probably right. It is something like we can change. If we can at least remove the year from the generated files and get tests to pass, that would be ideal. One of those things I thought, oh yeah, this will be really easy, and maybe not quite. But I just filed this right before this meeting, so I haven't had time to dig in very much. But yeah, I'll have an update out soon. Danian, you have a simple PR that ran into the same issue, but otherwise I think it looks good. Yeah.
Well, yeah, we'll hold it until this boilerplate year thing gets addressed. I did open an issue that it's tied to this PR.
Yeah.
This PR is pretty narrowly focused on a specific field, but I do believe that I've seen other fields that have the same issue. I didn't want to go ahead and make sweeping changes without at least making sure we're all on board with this change. So if this merges, I go back and address the other fields and then just cross-reference this PR.
Do you mean other places specific to TLS, or just other fields where we intended to have defaults and don't?
I believe there's another field in TLS, but I believe I haven't gone through all of the APIs to see how vast this issue is.
Okay.
But I believe that it is kind of goes across all the different APIs. But again, I haven't done any kind of audit. I just I'm working on the implementation side of things, hit this, and so that's really what prompted me to look at this issue. And while fixing this, I think there was another field in TLS that caught my eye on how we're doing the defaulting. And so that really prompted me to say, I think this is a bigger issue than just this particular field.
Got it. Yeah, it would even be great to, it's almost like this needs tests or something, just some, in upstream we have tests to ensure that defaults are applied the way we'd expect. It could make sense just as a sanity check to make sure that the defaults we've defined here are working as expected.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because right now, I mean, we're just testing to say, okay, can we instantiate, install the CRDs that get installed, and can we instantiate instances of those CRDs, right? We don't. There's no like, here's what's expected the custom resource to look like, with defaults.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So on that note, you mentioned implementation, and it seems like a number of people are working towards implementations here. One of our meetings in December, we kind of talked a little bit about if another versioned release would be helpful, not a V1 Alpha 2, but just a V0.2 that would basically be a point that implementations could target that included a number of these kind of bug fixes almost, instead of just, pulling from master. Is that the kind of thing that would be helpful as you're implementing this to have some kind of release in the next few weeks or month or something like that you could target? Or is just pinning to the latest acceptable for now?
I mean, I'd like to work on a release, and like this particular instance would be a bit of an issue from the implementation side, where we're expecting, we're not checking for nil on mode, right? We're expecting a value of terminate, and this would cause a problem on the implementation side. So yeah, I mean, after this merges, again, I go back and verify all the other fields. But yeah, to me, this particular bug, I'd like to see a release that includes the fix for this.
Yeah, and I know we have at least one fix in that is not associated with a release that was helpful for Knative. So I would imagine it would be good to get something out soon-ish. So maybe I'll create a milestone for. I don't think I've done one yet for V0.2.0, and maybe in the next. Maybe we can say sometime in January, we'll get that out. I don't know that we're at a point where we need to say a specific date quite yet, but we've got enough small little fixes that it could be useful for anyone. And I think we've got an increasing number of people working on implementations against this API that a more recent release could be helpful. Does that timeline seem reasonable?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool.
And going back to the tests that you mentioned too, so would that be something that conformance tests would, I guess not conformance tests. I mean, those would be tests that are really outside of conformance testing to ensure that the defaults are being set properly.
Right, exactly. I think it's it could be a very simple test, but I think this may be a good opportunity to again use kind, and again I think we might want to use our class. I've thought about the structure a little bit yet, and I think it's relatively simple to do. Maybe we use our own generated client to accomplish that. I'm not sure. Yeah, but it should be doable.
You know, now that I'm
And-
thinking too is on a different project. I'm testing this to ensure that defaults are being set to what's expected. Let me look at that and see how it could potentially be ported over here.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great, because yeah, there's definitely, although it may not be conformance tests, there's a lot of useful code in that conformance test work, like basically Go code that's interacting with these APIs and creating resources that could be relevant as well. So yeah, that would be a good area to make some progress on too. I guess it wouldn't catch this specific issue because we didn't have a default set at all, but it would be a reasonable way of listing all the defaults we expect and making sure they're working as expected. Because I know we've had some cases where, let's say we didn't have omit empty set or something like that, and our defaulting was not working as expected. So yeah.
And I actually just popped it in the chat window for the other project that I'm using. It's pretty simple on verifying how defaults being set for fields.
Cool. What test for, is this Ginkgo? No. It's been a while since I've.
And I'm sorry, that's actually this one. That one sets up the test environment, and then this one's actually testing an instance where, let's see here.
Okay.
Yeah,
all right,
Ginkgo and Go Mega.
Yep. Okay.
You could see, expecting the default replicas, expecting the default namespace they set.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense.
Do we want to stay away from Ginkgo and Go Mega for service APIs?
I know there had been some bias away from it when ingress controller conform. It seems like everyone has very strong opinions on test frameworks in Go. I don't know. Obviously, Ginkgo is used fairly broadly at this point. I'm one who I guess maybe doesn't have the strongest preference, but I would like to have some consistency in whatever frameworks we're using, and wherever possible. Like for simple tests, I enjoy just using the straightforward testing, Go testing framework. But yeah, if there's enough advantage to using something like Ginkgo, I'm not necessarily opposed to it. We need to be consistent throughout our project, so we don't have. I'd hate to get into a world where we have Go Dog, Go Test, and Ginkgo in the same project, because, yeah.
Should we file a separate issue on this, or do we want to use the issue that I filed about this defaulting not happening properly?
I think a separate issue would be great, because this really is a separate project of actually ensuring that the defaults we've intended are actually working.
I'll file that issue, and then I think it's something that we need to make a decision on and get these tests written. So, like I said, I go after this PR gets merged, I go back and kind of do a sweep of the APIs, but that not guaranteeing that I'm not going to miss something, right?
Right. But it is helpful. By writing tests like this, you kind of get this single place where you see all the defaults you've intended, and So this exercise could be helpful there as well. Great. Well, thanks for finding that and already getting a fix out for it. I think trying to close my many tabs now. Let me run back through some more PRs here. Was there anything else to say on this TLS defaulting? All right. Mark, I think he was on the call earlier and dropped off, but he has this PR that adds a lot of, I think, good clarification around the gateway to route binding, which I think is going to be one of our most complex and powerful features of this API. And as I've thought about conformance tests, I've thought, a lot of our effort is going to have to go into this relationship, the gateway to route relationship. And so he's taken, a fair bit of effort into trying to write up what this relationship looks like. Unfortunately, I have only had time for a quick skim of it. I have not given it a full run through detailed yet. I think, Harry, you've already done a first pass on this. Do you know how close this feels to being ready yet?
I think this is actually looking pretty good. There is
Okay.
so yeah, I mean, one or two more eyes would be helpful because
Yep.
this is sort of core to how our CRDs
Yeah.
interact.
Yeah.
So yeah, but this is a big positive change.
Okay, great. That's good to hear. Yeah, I mean, this is a complex area, and it's good to see it written out and well defined here. So I'll try and follow up here as well this later today, so I can so we can get another set of eyes on it. But if anyone else wants to take a look at that, this would be appreciated as well. You definitely don't need to be a project maintainer or someone who's been, just anyone who's interested in documentation. Please take a look at this. If part of this doesn't make sense or part of this is confusing, it'd be good to know, because I know at least I come at this from a perspective of someone who's already pretty familiar with the topic, and so I have my own biases. But it would be great to get as many perspectives as possible on this and understand if we still have some confusing points. All right. This is another tiny PR that was blocked by the CodeGen issues, the year in CodeGen. But James has been doing some really good work on this tool to generate CRD API reference docs, which we're using for our reference docs. He forked it so we could get some cool new functionality for types and actually showing a specific subset of types. And that has merged back into upstream. And so he's updating the reference back from his fork to Amit's original upstream fork, repo. So I think this is non-controversial entirely. We just need to wait for that other PR to get in. This one is probably a bit more interesting, and it's caused more conversation. And yes, also got the welcome to 2021. As I recall, with this Golang CI lint, the rationale was that we wanted to be able to exclude specific things from linting. And yes, a lot more control over false positive. I Yeah, I don't know. I need to think about this a little
So-
bit more. Or go ahead.
Yeah, so this is this was specifically for the HTML doc that we generate based on our types. So we have like something like TLS mode terminate is equal to terminate. That's a constant defined inside our package. Now TLS mode terminate needs a Go doc of type TLS mode terminate represents the terminate mode of TLS or something like that, right?
Yeah.
That comes out very awkward in the HTML output. So rather having a have like TLS mode terminate is equal to terminate would have a comment of type terminate means that TLS is being terminated at the gateway of some sorts. So that's
Yeah.
the main reason. And I think Go Formed I think complains on that, or maybe it's Go Wet which complains on that and that style of comment.
Got it. Yeah. And so, yeah, I remember this. Thank you for the reminder. Yeah, I mean, that does seem like a relatively reasonable change as long as we, one of the things I'd push back on in the past were changes to Go comments purely to ensure that the reference docs were more readable, but in turn resulted in weird syntax inside the Go comments. And I don't want to harm our Go comments, our Go types files, just so that we can have nicer generated HTML for our reference doc. This specific example seems like a very reasonable exception to that. I don't think that it's necessarily critical that every Go comment starts with the type it's referring to. But I would be hesitant to go much further and to introduce weird syntax into Go comments, though admittedly we already have all our fun annotations like Kube Builder and whatever, so we've already kind of broken that somewhat. Yeah. Okay, well, apparently I need to take a look. Harry, it looks like you've already generally approved this, and this is also 2021 blocking PR or blocked by the
mostly that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Happy New Year. All right. Then, I remember this. James has taken a good look at API documentation, and this is, I thought there was a broader, yeah. So this is that what I was describing earlier, that there are some things like this that feel a little off to me, because like this is a link that works in the generated reference doc, but is potentially nonsensical inside here, inside Go types. And so it feels like ideally we'd have a better way to detect these in whatever tool we're using to generate the docs. Yeah, I'd left an overarching comment on the PR, but I have not added it to each specific line item. I don't know. I'm open to ideas here. I recognize that this would be useful for reference docs. Does anyone feel particularly strongly on this?
I think it would be really like the ideal scenario would be that Go docs as well as our HTML docs are like they look nice and they have all the good user experience, but we need to settle on one and keep that perfect. and the granularity changes. Like in Kubernetes APIs, I usually resort to Go docs of Kube APIs. Everybody has their preferences, but you need to stick to one. And I agree with Rob there, where I think we should make sure that the Go docs are as clean as possible and as navigable as possible. And then the HTML one, if we really want to, we can do contributions upstream to fix issues like the one on line 127 here.
Right. Or go ahead, Mike.
I'd be especially concerned for the generated CRDs. If you do a kubectl explain, it's not going to do anything with the markdown syntax, right?
Yeah, you're that's a good point. We are going, everything we put into these comments is going to end up in our generated CRDs, including this markdown, which would look strange. That's a very compelling point. And it's likely already in this PR somewhere. Yeah.
A related thing, I'm not sure we've talked about this before, but Godoc is really annoying how the Godoc goes into the CRD, and your Godoc will refer to Kubernetes, will refer to Go types or Go field names, which will differ from the API.
Yes. Yes. I completely agree with that. Consistent problem that we run into. Maybe this is actually escaped out of the CRD CRD YAML, because I'm not seeing anything like that. I'll have to take a closer look. But certainly if that had happened, that would be a significant problem. But you're right, even without that, the unfortunate casing and types, yeah. Okay. Well, just a reminder, this PR exists. It seems like, or maybe I'm just reading too much into this, but it seems like it would be ideal if we can find a way to find an alternative to markdown links. Something that automatically finds keywords and links to them would be awesome. But again, that may be asking too much. Yeah. I'll add a few more comments on this one. All right. Basic validation. I know Chris has been active in Slack, and this PR continues to evolve. I've added a few comments on here, and so have a lot of other people. Thank you for the continued review. I think this is getting reasonably close. It sounded like today he's just working on setting up certs, and the logic is mostly there. So excited to see this come along too. We have a couple relatively large draft PRs right now, and it's exciting to see this one get pretty close. And I think the others are kind of old and stale. Is that correct? This one is breaking because is indefinitely on hold until we do V1 Alpha 2. Yeah. And then the request and retry attributes is really, as we start to transition back, I think once we start to have a bit more progress, or, an initial webhook that's ready, and maybe some initial conformance tests, we can start focusing again more on API additions. And this is one that is obviously has a lot of history here. But it would be good to start thinking about now, or continue thinking about where this belongs in the API. I know I had initially said, well, hey, maybe this belongs in backend policy. But there are plenty of examples of where these kinds of config could also make sense on a route, and that's what this PR does. So need some more thought here on where. It could be both resources, but that is something like that I think in the next couple weeks we're going to start to revisit the kind of API additions and changes we want to see in the new year. As we've started to, we're getting to the point where we have taken on kind of more of the boring grunt work. I guess it all depends on your perspective, but starting to work on performance tests and webhook and whatever. And once we start to have that foundation, I think we're going to be in a better place to start making additions to the API again. And these kinds of things will be key. So yeah, and I know this is, I'm sure needs rebase is an understatement at this point. But the concept is something that we still need to keep top of mind going forward. All right, are there any recent issues that we should discuss, or anything? Thank you, Damian, for creating that, the latest couple. I think the only new one would be this route selector improvement issue. It looks like Mark is not on this call. Yeah, selection mechanisms differ from. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I do remember this. I discussed this briefly with him. The idea is that it feels unnecessarily risky for a gateway selector to select everything by default, everything in the same namespace by default. And so if we require the field to be set, we can somewhat get around that. This is, a service with an empty selector by default selects nothing and relies on you creating your custom endpoints. But by default, the behavior, it's not selecting anything. And so a gateway with an empty selector selecting everything does feel a little off. The empty selector thing definitely is a shortcut. It simplifies the simple use case, but maybe that value is too limited, and it would be clearer if we actually required the field. I think making the field required is a breaking change, so we'd have to wait for V1 Alpha 2. But I'm not necessarily against this. Does anyone want to leave the route selector optional and leave that behavior in of a empty selector matches everything?
So by empty selector, do we mean like explicit braces, or is that like nil selector?
I think what we have right now, I can't remember. We've gone through a few states, but I think we may actually have a default of empty, okay, I think it's not a pointer, so there is no nil. So the default is empty object. And by default, the interpretation of a selector in Kubernetes is that empty means all. And so maybe what we need to do is just change our interpretation here, or somehow find a way to require that object is not empty. I'm not sure.
Yeah, this is Selector is so confusing. I need to go back and
It
look
is.
before I
It
make
is.
any comments.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the confusing thing is you have the namespaces field, which tells you whether or not that selector does anything.
Well, so the namespaces field would be, sorry, did I cut you off?
No, sorry, I'm misreading this. Okay, yeah, you have a selector. You can have a selector for routes, or you can have a selector for
Yeah.
namespaces.
Well, they work together. So you select routes with label foo, and those are in any matching namespace. And so by default, it's the same namespace, but you could change namespaces to be for all namespaces or whatever. But in most cases, I'm imagining it'll be a single namespace.
The core issue here is that if selector is unspecified, then by default will select all routes from the same namespace as a gateway, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So it's like by default we're open, right? We're saying,
Yeah.
okay, let's change this and almost like by default make it secure.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Given that the
Yeah,
default for the namespaces is same, it doesn't feel that risky.
That was the argument initially, but as I've thought about it more, I am more in favor of, although it's not that risky, requiring people to be explicit, because some people do have fairly large namespaces. So if, let's say, they deploy everything in their default namespace for whatever reason, I don't know. And then they just deploy gateway and accidentally expose. I mean, I don't know. It's just easier to accidentally expose things this way.
It doesn't seem like people who care about security would put everything in default, but I kind of get your point.
I agree. I agree. But I mean, that people who care about security wouldn't do a lot of things. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have same defaults. Like, people who care about security probably aren't using defaults for many cases either. But yeah, and yeah.
If we think about ease of use, so if we make this change, then from an easy use standpoint, right? Because there's definitely gonna be the flip side where it's, small environments that want to make it easy to use service APIs. And so the user would have to specify a selector, and it would just be an empty selector to match all routes in the same namespace as a gateway.
What Mark is suggesting, if I'm understanding this issue correctly, is that you simply cannot use an empty selector. You would have to use labels. You would have to specify something. An empty selector would be interpreted as matching nothing. And the argument for that is that matches service behavior, which a lot of people are going to be familiar with here, where service empty selector by default doesn't match anything. And I get that. Though it, like you're saying, it does dramatically increase the complexity of our simplest use case. Because previously our simplest use case was gateway spec listeners kind HTTP route, and that's it. And then it just selects all HTTP routes in your namespace, and you're done. And that felt awfully convenient. But as I've thought about it more, especially as you get into larger namespaces, it makes it more likely that accidents can happen. And as we've learned from Kubernetes itself, it's a whole lot harder to go the secure default route after you've already made open defaults. It's very difficult to further restrict things in the future.
Well, if that's the case, is there other areas in the APIs that we should then consider? Because can't think of other examples off the top of my head, but I know that was in the back of our minds of like, okay, how do we try to make this simple? Because the APIs are already fairly complex. So
yeah,
if we make this change, we may want to kind of do an audit across all the APIs and say, okay, well, is there other areas that we're kind of doing default open that we should now say, okay, by default, it's secure across all the APIs?
that's a great question. I do think this is one of the most important ones. Like the gateway route relationship is pretty key, but I imagine there are other ones that like I'm not thinking of right now that are default open or default easy to use that may not be quite as secure as we'd like by default. But again, like you're alluding to, there is this endless balance of ease of use and secure defaults, and it's hard to find the right balance because our API is already adding a fair amount of complexity on top of Ingress or any other API it might be related to. Well, if you have thoughts, I know we're at time now, but if you have any follow-up thoughts, I'm sure Mark would appreciate comments here. And also be good to be thinking about other places we are maybe leaving our defaults a little too open or too secure, and wherever we have that balance a little bit off. Yeah, cool. And you linked one more PR.
I just want to go back to this. Where did we leave the discussion earlier in the call? I mean, is this something that we need to talk to someone in legal, and what's the right way to do this, or are we fine moving forward, following some of the other projects by removing the year from the boilerplate and generated?
I feel like it'll be a lot cleaner, a lot easier to make that decision if we can do what Harry had suggested, find a way to remove the year from generated code only and retain the year in all the code that we've actually written. That feels like a reasonable compromise in what we've seen in other upstream projects. I'm trying to think of the appropriate SIG to ask, and all I can think of is contribx. Maybe they can at least redirect me. But first I want to see if I can get to that closer to ideal state that Harry had kind of mentioned, because that would simplify a lot. And if I can, I'll also try to get some, confirmation from someone in contribx or any recommended SIG you might think of. But I think that pattern is pretty widely followed. I just need to figure out how to do it.
All right. So should this PR be marked draft or hold until?
Yeah, let me. I need to log in, but I will do that. Or if you want to hold it, if you're already in, that'd be great too. I switch between computers for my Zoom calls, and apparently this computer hasn't been on GitHub in a while. So, yay, new year.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and hold it.
Cool. All right. Well, sounds good. I think that's all we have for today. Again, would really love feedback on a lot of PRs, but especially if you want to think about conformance and what makes sense there. I'm going to not push too far forward for a few days on this because I want to get a little bit more feedback on direction before I go any further. But yeah, so if anyone has time to look through that and look through other approaches, would appreciate any feedback you have. And with that, happy Wednesday, happy New Year, and we'll talk to you everyone next week. Have a good one.